Hello, my name is Andrew Westover, and I'm the Key Pairing Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's roundtable conversation about experiments in art and technology. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. This program is presented in conjunction with the New Museum exhibition, Ed Atkins, Get Life, Loves Work, which is currently on view. The exhibition is curated by Massimiliano Gioni, Edlis Neeson Artistic Director of the New Museum. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Research and Residencies Council, and digital initiatives are supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. I'll now share brief biographical details about today's panelists. Daniel Birnbaum is a Swedish art critic, theoretician, curator, and the director of Acute Art, a platform which brings together international artists, new media, and technology to produce and exhibit visual artworks in virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. Previously, Birnbaum curated the first Moscow Biennale, Art de Paris, with Christine Marcel at the Centre Pompidou, the second Yokohama Triennial, and Zero at Martin Gropius Bau in Berlin. In 2009, he was the director of the 53rd Venice Biennale. Birnbaum co-authored Spacing Philosophy, Lyotard and the Idea of the Exhibition with Swedish philosopher and professor Sven-Olof Wallensten. Domhnaill Hernon is a technology, innovation, and creativity executive. He is the global lead and co-founder of an initiative at EY to create the cognitive human enterprise, an approach to amplifying organizational cognitive diversity by investing in full spectrum diversity and multidisciplinary collaboration. While at Nokia-Bell Labs, he founded an initiative to fuse art and engineering and science to develop solutions that humanize technology. Domhnaill's work has been featured in Wired, Times Square, South by Southwest, NASDAQ, MWC, Ars Electronica, TEDx, InspireFest, among others, and he advises innovation and cultural programs globally. Julie Martin is a writer, editor, and producer who has worked with experiments in art and technology since the 1960s. She worked with Robert Whitman extensively, collaborating with Whitman and other artists on the performance series 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering at the 69th Regiment Armory in New York. In 1967, Martin joined the staff of E.A.T. as editor and worked closely with Billy Klüver on projects that E.A.T. carried out from 1996 to the present. With Klüver and art historian Barbara Rose, Martin co-edited the book Pavilion that documents the Pepsi Pavilion, which was designed and built by E.A.T. for Expo 70 in Osaka. Martin is co-executive producer of a series of films begun in 1995, which document the artist's performances in 9 Evenings, Theater and Engineering. She is also the coordinating producer of Whitman's theater performances Swim, Local Report, Passport, and Moon Rain. Philippe Parreno is a French artist and filmmaker working in a wide range of media, including film, sculpture, performance, drawing, and text. Select solo exhibitions and site-specific installations include Philippe Parreno, a manifestation of objects at the Watari Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, Echo at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Anywhen at the Tate Modern in London, and Anywhere, Anywhere Out of the World at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. Parreno's multidisciplinary practice has led to collaborations with artists Liam Gillick, Karsten Huller, Pierre Hugh, and Rikrit Tirana, among others. Now, a few logistical notes before we begin. This program will last for just over 1 hour. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there is time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming public programs on our website, newmuseum.org. And now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to Massimiliano Gioni.
We have a great lineup today, and so I'm actually just going to turn it over to our guests, who I think are being a little shy. They can now turn on their cameras if they want, and we're going to start this conversation around experiments in art and technology, about the legacy of this legendary program and the way in which those experiences can inform the work of young artists or artists today. This conversation is on the occasion of Ed Atkins' exhibition at the New Museum, which was a production initiated by Nokia-Bell Labs, and particularly by the, let's say, reincarnation or the relaunching of the experiments in art and technology at Nokia-Bell Labs. So we have the great honor of an amazing lineup, and I want to start by inviting Julie Martin to tell us a little bit more about the birth of experiments in art and technology, of which she's been not only a witness, but a midwife, an initiator, and instigator. So Julie, I know you're going to talk more specifically about collaborations between science and art. And if you want to take it away, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this. And I'll talk very fast because there's a lot of information. I start with E.A.T. and we're talking about the E.A.T. then and the legacy of E.A.T. And of course, it started with Billy Klüver, who was an engineer, came to the United States in 1954 and got a PhD in electrical engineering at UC Berkeley. He then came to Bell Labs in 1958 and began to work as a member of technical staff there. He had long felt that the outlook of engineers was much too, much too limited. And he really was looking to the idea of how could he expand the outlook and experience of engineers. Let's see if I can now. The first opportunity came when his friend Pontus Hultén, who was head of Moderna Museet in Stockholm, introduced him by mail to Jean Tingley, who needed help with a project he was doing in New York. And Billy and Jean worked together on one of Jean's metamatic machines that was to destroy itself in the garden of the Museum of Modern Art. Billy and his colleague Harold Hodges built the timing mechanisms that would bring about certain destructive things, the fire, things would collapse, et cetera, et cetera. And from this experience, Billy began to get the idea that the engineer could offer a new palette to artists. And he began to, as he came to New York, worked in New York, began to work with artists individually. First, Yvonne Rainer, he provided a wireless microphone so that you could hear the sound of her breathing while she danced. For Jasper Johns, a neon R for one of his paintings, but wireless. And this is something very interesting. The artist really began to intuit about wireless and wanted wireless technology. For Merce Cunningham and John Cage, he devised a triggering system so that a sound would be triggered as the dancers moved on the stage. And then a much more iconic collaboration with Andy Warhol that started out as Andy wanted a floating light bulb. But when faced with the fact that battery technology would make it be as big as the house, and Andy got some of this aluminized mylar, he simply folded it over and made what he called silver pillows. Again, floating sculpture. But probably the most significant collaboration that Billy was engaged with was Bob Rauschenberg. Bob started out wanting an environment in which everything changed to react to the viewer, but of course the technology wasn't there in those days, and it developed into a sound sculpture oracle in which radios in that piece that Billy's working on would broadcast sound to receivers in the other sculptures. The viewer, it was interactive, the viewer could change the scan rate and the sound, but there would constantly be a soundscape, like a city soundscape for oracle. Working with Bob, Billy realized Bob's idea that he collaborated with the material. And Billy realized that in fact, what he was doing was collaboration with the artist. And they were working on something that could develop more than what the artist thought in the beginning, and also could expand the engineer's ideas about what was possible. As he was looking around for the idea to broaden this concept, the opportunity to do a series of performances started in Sweden, a Festival of Art and Technology, but when they were unable to go to Sweden, it took place at the 69th Regiment Armory. Bob Rauschenberg asked his friends, choreographers, composers, 10 artists, and Billy began to talk to his friends at Bell Laboratories to collaborate with the artists. And that began in the beginning of 1966, meetings. Upper left is the first meeting of artists and engineers, and then you see more scenes of them working together and beginning to develop specific things for specific artists, but also they developed a system in which, a wireless system in which sound could trigger lights, et cetera, movement, et cetera. And here you have Herb Schneider, Bob Rauschenberg, Lucinda Childs, Robbie Robinson, Per Bjorn, and Billy looking at a model of this, what they call the team system. So I can't talk about all the projects, but I want to talk about some of the collaborations because I think it's really about the collaboration. Here we have Fred Waldhauer, and behind him, Ralph Lynn. Fred Waldhauer, who worked with David Tudor, who put contact mics on his bandoneon, and as he played the bandoneon, lights, sound change, etc. To the left is an invention of Waldhauer's, a proportional control system with which a light pin, he could move sound from speaker to speaker or turn off and on lights, which he did during David's performance. Bob Whitman worked with video and with video projection. He had projectors, video and film projectors in a car, and from small scenes on the balcony, he projected these images quite large. And to the left, you see one of the things he worked with. He'd gotten from an engineer at Mount Sinai Hospital, the fiber optics, so that he could project an image of something inside someone's pocket as one of the images. Bob Rauschenberg worked with Pete Kaminsky, and here Kaminsky devised a very small FM transmitter that would fit in the handle of the racket, so that each time the racket was hit, a very loud bong resounded throughout the armory and a light went off. And that this game progressed until the army was in darkness. And then with this camera, which we see to the left, this infrared camera that Bob got from Bill Hardy, there on the right in the photo, he could film this crowd of 500 people in the dark so that the audience could in fact see in the dark. As they were working together, Billy, Bob Rauschenberg, Fred Waldhauer, and Bob Whitman began to talk, and they committed themselves to the idea that these collaborations should continue. The way they should continue was to form an organization. So actually, just before E.A.T, the 9 Evenings in September, E.A.T was incorporated as a not-for-profit organization. And when 9 Evenings was over, they began to operate, printed a newsletter which it communicated with artists and engineers. And the real push was to attract engineers. We had a booth at IEEE. Here you see Tom Gormley and Hans Hake talking to engineers to get them to sign up. They had a lecture demonstration series in the loft on 16th Street. Here, Harry Kogelnick from Bell Labs talks about holography and lasers. And to the right, Marta Minujín, who's working with Per Bjorn, is being filmed by CBS as a part of this propaganda, but she did a phone booth in which Per Bjorn made different things happen depending on her instructions. So this outreach to artists and engineers continued until by '69, there were probably 2,000 artist members, engineer members, and the matching systems for doing that was quite well established. When the opportunity for E.A.T came through Robert Breer, whose neighbor, David Thomas, was an executive PepsiCo, and they were going to do a pavilion at Expo 70. E.A.T then got the commission to make this pavilion, and Breer and Billy chose a core artist, Breer, Frosty Myers, David Tudor, and Robert Whitman, and to begin the to form this idea of what do you do with a pavilion. And all of them agreed that you make a very rich visual environment that was open to people to explore and create their own experience. Here we see the first trip to Japan, and they're looking at what was to become the pavilion. It was a hole in the ground at this point. Oh, what happened? That's weird. I'm sorry. Something happened. So this was the dome was given by the Japanese company, and so then the artist started out with this given dome, and what can you do? So each of the artists not only contributed to the overall design, but each had a collaboration that contributed one part of it. One of this was Robert Breer, and here you see he worked with Lola Benslot and John Wright, who's fixing the chassis of the float, the sculpture, and made these large moving sculptures on the plaza of the pavilion that moved at 1 foot per minute with sound included. Fujiko Nakaya worked with physicist Tom Nee, here you can see him there at the pumps at the pavilion, to create a pure water-based fog. This is the iconic photo of the fog covering the pavilion. This was the artist's idea about how you could deal with a building you didn't like. You make it very beautiful by covering it with fog. Frosty Myers worked with Niels Young, shown here, to make a light sculpture, a tilted arc of the towers with xenon lights aimed at each other, to form this arc around the pavilion at night, this square. And Lowell Cross, here seen on the left, worked to build a mechanism to do laser patterns which shower down on visitors as they walk the floor. This is a laser deflection system that David Tudor provided the sound so that these patterns would play on the floor of the first floor of the pavilion. Gordon Muma is seen here wiring the control console. This was a control console on the floor of the main room of the pavilion, which could either be programmed or could be performed live, light, sound, other activities in the mirror dome. We also worked with our architect, John Pierce, had a very unique idea for making a 90-foot diameter spherical mirror out of mylar, rather than just an air pressure blowing up. That way, he devised the negative pressure air structure. Here you see it being installed, which made a mirror, a spherical mirror, the main feature of which was the upside down. You could see yourself upside down on the floor. Then the visitor was allowed to move very freely in this environment and take part in the visual and other sound events that were being programmed. This, particularly Bob Whitman and Billy Klüver, as they worked together, realized that the collaboration with artists and engineers could go further. Certainly the working for the pavilion was a situation, although there were pieces, works of art, it was a situation outside of art. And Billy and Bob came to the idea of projects outside art, in which artists would be part of multidisciplinary teams that would address other issues. And the first one that we did was the Anand project. We were invited by Vikram Sarabhai, here you see in the middle, in this kind of cut-off photograph, who was head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and there was going to be a ATSF satellite over India that could broadcast to villages. So he asked E.A.T. to put together a team of artists, engineers to come to India, work with their counterparts, and devise how do you make educational programming for a satellite that would go to these disparate villages. And the iconic buffalo here is because we chose the Anand district where the buffaloes were kept by the women. The milk was collected every day from thousands of villages and sent to a central dairy. And the idea was to use half-inch video in the villages to let the villagers record their daily life, record how they work. And this would be the basic visual material that would go back and be part of the educational programming. E.A.T. wasn't involved for a number of reasons, but in 1975, the SITE site project was launched in India, and many of these ideas of forgetting local content were included. We also did a project with Marcia Newfield and at NYU, who's an education specialist. And this idea we built, it was called Children in Communication. We built 2 centers. Here you see the very child-centered center devised by Bob Whitman. And in it were the communications devices of the day, telex, electrowriter, fax machine, telephone, and the 2 places were connected by telephone lines with the idea that children would work with the equipment, really communicate, and they could then, in schools, other places, they could reach out and connect with other children without having to leave their neighborhood. And then
that was the beginning of Zoom school, I would say.
Exactly. I mean, I think you see beginnings of a lot of things here. And then just the last one I'd talk about is the idea with the Arizona Environmental Research was the idea of doing rooftop gardening. And we did a hydroponic gardens for rooftop, which was going to be for Automation House and then the UN school. It's only stayed a proposal at this time, but I think you know about the growth of rooftop gardening and city agriculture. So these were really the idea, and I would say the legacy, we talked about then now, the legacy of E.A.T. was this idea of collaboration between individuals working on, it could be art or it could be other issues in society, but the idea of the human interaction that can solve problems going into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And we'll come back with, I'm sure, questions and a few thoughts. I want to hand it over to Daniel Birnbaum, who was the director of the Moderna Museum from, I believe, 2008 until 2019, and now is the director of Acute Art, which is a project that develops artworks with the help of virtual reality and augmented reality. And Daniel is also part of this conversation because he met Billy Klüver. I don't remember in which year, he can tell us. And also by being the director of the Moderna Museum, had the opportunity in a sense to live out the legacy of E.A.T. in an institution that was very much both shaped and promulgated the ideas that he had developed. So Daniel, you want to tell us a little bit about your contact with Klüver?
It was so lovely to hear Julie talk about this, and actually great to see some of these images that I have lived with for many years, because for almost a decade I ran a museum that I feel was influenced in so many ways by Billy Klüver and his group of people. The whole kind of conversation around art and technology informed the programs, but also it's very visible in the collections of Moderna Museet. Moderna Museet is not a huge museum like the Tate or the Pompidou or the MoMA, but it's a kind of paradigmatic modernist museum with some strengths. And I would say one of the interesting threads that runs through that museum has very much to do with Billy. And yes, I did know Billy, but not really. I made a big interview with him for a daily paper in Sweden in the 1990s when he launched a first chapter, I think it was. All that those 9 evenings were all documented, and they're all films, and they are actually in some collections, including the collection of Moderna Museet. Who I did know quite well was Pontus Hultén, the first director of Moderna Museet, and a key person in many museums, of course, including Pompidou and Mocha and whatnot. But I would say he was obsessed with he had a kind of machinic fantasy, he was obsessed with Picabia, maybe his favorite artist, and Duchamp, and then later on Tinguely. And it runs like a thread right through the collections. Of course, we often asked ourselves, how do you work with this? I mean, we did shows. We showed the Rauschenberg collection, the Tinguely collection, and that documentation of 9 evenings. And as a museum director, part of what you do, of course, is you try to create new connections. And Stockholm is not Silicon Valley, but Skype is from Stockholm, Spotify is from Stockholm, Ericsson, one of the leading manufacturers of networks and telephones. And so I always try to bring them in. And one of the last things that I initiated was a show called Mud Muses. It wasn't curated by me, it was curated by a Danish friend and colleague of mine, Lars Bang Larsen. Yeah, I think it's been, maybe the strongest influence on that museum is Hultén, of course, and some of his friends, and Billy Klüver. And I have to say that it's once or twice every century, I guess there's something new emerging, some new visual system, visual medium. We all know that when photography appeared, people didn't know what it was. Is this science? Is this esoteric science? Will it kill painting? All these exaggerations and misunderstandings actually produce some sort of maybe interesting moment of experimentation. And I'm not a media theorist, but we can say during the 20th century, we've seen film, and then the video camera, and television, of course, and then the internet. And I guess that today we have a cluster of new mediums, and maybe some of the technicians would say it's almost one thing: mixed reality, VR, AR. And Ed Atkins, of course, is a great inspiration for me. Someone we showed a lot at the museum, or at least in many constellations. And I think we're again in a moment of exaggerations and confusions where we don't really know where all of this will go. It creates some sort of, maybe a little bit of freedom before things are totally defined and at some point totally commercialized often. I think, I wish I could see Ed's show, because I'm sure it's, an interesting thing. I'm in Basel, in the middle of the epicenter of the art market. So it's, strange to be right here. It opens today. And it's almost ironic that, there's a very well-known German car manufacturer that produced, art cars. I won't mention their name, but what's launched tonight, and where I have to run in a few seconds, is the Robert Rauschenberg art car in AR. I was a little bit involved in it, but we're in a new era. But I think the idea of collaborations between new technologists or engineers and artists is as promising and interesting as ever. So I think the vision, the legacy of E.A.T. is that vision still is alive, even if there are new mediums, new technologies, and of course new generations of artists. But the collaborative mode is interesting, and that's what Philippe and all his close colleagues and friends can talk more about. I saw Philippe just a few days ago in France, and to see all those artists who have been really, again, collaborating brings us back to something, a little bit the spirit of E.A.T, I think. I'll stop there, but I do think.
Can I ask you a question before you run away? Two questions. The irony is, Ed piece is a piece about telecommunications, so how more appropriate than this convening on Zoom. I want to ask you one is actually a quote from Pontus Hultén, who described Billy Klüver as Edison, Tesla, Steinmetz, Marconi, Leonardo da Vinci of the American avant-garde, which is an incredibly generous description for a relationship that lasted decades. And maybe Julie can also tell us, one of the unrealized projects of Billy Klüver and Pontus Hultén was to create a kind of huge screen for the square of the Pompidou, with this idea also of broadcasting the museum out in the street and digitally, which again seems so prescient today. But Daniel, you spoke about mediums, which is obviously a very interesting word when thinking also of other aspects of your work, and also thinking of Philippe's work. So the medium obviously as a tool of technology, but also the medium as a possessed human being. And you've been involved with Ilma af Klint's work. You are editing her catalog Raisonné. You gave her an amazing show at Moderna Museum. And recently you also wrote in our forum a sort of rhapsody about the artist as medium. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, as what happens when the imagination of technology gets somewhat incarnated in a person. And we know also the idea of medium was very much related to the beginning of radio technology, the beginning of X-ray technology, this notion that technology was inside our body that now seems so, again, both comforting and disturbing in these last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to spontaneously react to these things. I mean, I did see Billy Klüver in action once, and he was probably some sort of Tesla-like charismatic person, because he spoke at the Film Institute, you know, where Ingmar Bergman and all the people used to be in the good old days, in Stockholm. And it was just a boring press conference, but he turned it into something fantastic. So, I mean, I'm not the person to really describe him, but at that moment I remember, and that was when I then made the interview for the biggest Swedish daily paper. So, no, a charisma person, if there's ever been one in that field. Yes, and I wrote a strange text for Artforum. It just came out, and I've been working with Hilma af Klint, who was, you know, a kind of mystic, and actually, you're not innocent yourself, Massimiliano, since you showed her at the Venice Biennale. We made her very visible. She had been a secret artist, more or less, and she didn't want to reach big audiences maybe during her lifetime. And I think sometimes artists can be prophetic. I don't mean this in a silly, romantic, old, you know, way that, you know, in the religious sense maybe, but that people try to do things that aren't really possible yet. That, you know, prophetic in the sense that they're trying to do things that can only be done in the in the next medium. It's actually been, you know, I like a quote from Walter Benjamin where he talks about this, that from that famous text about reproduction, that some artists try to do what they can't. They try to produce things that can be done in a future art form. And I mean, Duchamp always anticipated everything, as we know. So of course, people try to say now that the glass is a kind of, you know, AR piece, and that the reflection and the opacity or the transparency and the broken glass is like the broken iPhone. I said it myself somewhere. It's a bit silly, of course. Hilma af Klint wanted to do some sort of immersive art. I mean, some sort of art that maybe can be realized could not be realized during her lifetime. She wanted to build a temple. No one really knows what that temple was meant to be. A kind of inner temple, a kind of higher temple, but also building. And my little text in Artforum is a kind of fantasy about what would it be to actually realize that in the mediums we now have access to. Maybe this could be a kind of surprising, slightly occult E.A.T. project for the future.
Well, hopefully it won't take us to the Hilma af Klint experience, like the Van Gogh experience. That would be frightening, no. But it could be extremely popular and financially viable.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see.
Thank you, Daniel. And if you speak out, we'll maybe continue.
I'll be here, but you know, at some point I will be interrupted. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Philippe, I want to bug you to use a term that also connects both to nature and technology with a few questions. So obviously, you know, you are here as an artist. You're also here maybe carrying a few burdens, because you are among the contemporary artists one that has questioned the place of technology in our present with, you know, deep philosophical intuition. And you have also revisited the legacy that we're discussing. You know, most famously in 2012, you staged and collaborated with the Philadelphia Museum of Art and with the Barbican to present the exhibition Dancing Around the Bride, which included the work of Rauschenberg, Duchamp, Jasper Johns, and many others. And there was a sort of mechanical fantasy that reconnected also very intimately with the experiments of E.A.T. And just a few months ago, you inaugurated what is an incredible tour de force in Arles at the Luma Foundation with this piece that is a room that moves and breathes and changes with a combination of mechanical and digital technology. So, well, the first simple question is, when and how you became aware of E.A.T. and if he had an influence on your work, and then maybe we can take it from there.
Hi everybody. Yes, I had E.A.T. of course had an enormous influence on me from right away when I started to be aware of like things that happened in the 60s, you know. And so when I came into the art school in Grenoble, where I was with Dominique Gonzalez-Force and other artists, you know, we were totally, I mean, I say we because it was not only me, but a bunch of artists were totally attracted, compelled by the work that an experiment that was produced by E.A.T. And I will say more than that. I will say that we took it for granted. We thought that was it. that was the way we produced art, That was for me the idea of producing something that is temporary, locally. It was this idea of like displacement, wonder, the moment where a time-based work will be allowed, and will produce poetry. And Julie insisted many times during that little introduction that could maybe, about this idea of collaboration, And it's like, of course, I took it because it's like behind that word lies so many ideas, one being the fact that we have to talk to each other to produce form, There's no way around. So if we don't talk to somebody else and we talk to the God, or we talk to something. So we have, and we are part of the many deities, that are around. So, of course, E.A.T. was crucial. The work of Rauschenberg, of course, when the events were crucial. The work of because it was also the way, for example, the sound was discreetly there. The use of the camera, in the getting the audience, into the darkness. These things, like we can still. I was influenced when I did even my Armory show. I looked at it when I thought like it was for me. I took that in my. It was part of my construction in a way, And yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I was thinking something you just said about some quality of your work and the works of E.A.T. even more than the work of individual artists. Not the way, as you say, that the works were temporary. The works, in a sense, like some of your pieces, you can't place a beginning or an end to it. They're more organisms, so they are more open-ended. So the question I have for you, which goes back to also what Daniel was saying, I think within your own work, we have witnessed a moment in which technology has caught up with your ideas. No, I think at the beginning, you were trying to achieve your ideas and realize them with tools that almost were not in sync with your ideas. And I think that the beauty also of your trajectory has been that in the last maybe 10 years, most dramatically, but I would say 15 or so, we have witnessed a kind of alignment between the technology and science and what you wanted to do. I don't know if you experience it that way, but
yeah, I think it's exactly what Julie was talking about. There was a moment when things can be the path of things, of like, what we happen to be like the huge shift toward technology and the politics that go with it could be affected by the way artists use them, and so what E.A.T. did like proved it, to be a way to proceed. And then of course after that it became in science fiction what they call the cyberpunk. There's a way when technology comes into the hand of the wrong person, so to speak, then he can produce amazing things, So both shift and displacement are needed more than today than ever, since there's things are spinning up, to a point where I don't know where we're going, but it's kind of interesting. So yes, there was a shift, but then it's interesting to go back. I was certainly fascinated by what Julie mentioned, because it goes really fast, but then you realize that how much all these things have been produced from Fukijo Nakaya or the performance armory of Rauschenberg, how we can see, or the pavilion, that inflated, how you can see that things been not only been highly influenced, been copied, throughout the recent years by people using it. And so it is, in fact, a form of collaboration through time. I see it in a really positive way, that things are produced and then forgotten and reinvented, in a way. So what you see, what happened with E.A.T. was a stutterer, and then it became more and more crystallized. Of course, you had this show that we talked about many times, Massimiliano, that influenced me as E.A.T. influenced me because it was the same years where I was aware of this fantastic shift, you know. But there was E.A.T, there was also the show of Les Immatériaux in Paris in '85. There was another way, you know, the cyborg manifesto in the same year, you know. So all these things came together, and I think it was in a way a legacy of what happened in New York with E.A.T, you know. I mean, I see it like that, you know.
In your work, and I think particularly, you know, the show at Luma, the piece at Luma, or your incredible exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo, there is an ability to connect technology today to a kind of dream that runs through the 20th century. You know, when you did the Palais de Tokyo, it was a show about electricity with the kind of automated piano and this sort of romance of technology that runs through the 19th century until today. You know, one could think of Jules Verne and the electricity of the, you know, Paris as the capital of the 19th and 20th century. So there is often in your work this kind of look forward to the future, but a strange nostalgia also that I don't know if you feel comfortable in describing that way. And I'm curious how, you know, maybe the other way to ask you is, how do you deal with obsolescence, you know, in your own tools, in your own technology, but also in this kind of novel of the 20th century, which is the, you know, on many levels, the story of energy and electricity and labor also, if you look at it from.
Yeah, it's funny, the Palais de Tokyo for me, of course, it was maybe there was something nostalgic, but I think it didn't really have to do with much of the. It was more the fact at the time, on a personal level, I was dealing with cancer, so more than anything else, you know, and I was dealing with my own subjectivity. But I don't think it was meant to be seen or to be as a sort of something nostalgic. It was much more the idea to deal with things that I was haunted by. You know, we talk it from E.A.T, and we can even write that story to today, you know. But this idea that it was not about exhibition, but more about manifestations. Lyotard stated really clearly when he did a show in '85 in Bobo, he said it's not exhibitions, it's how to show something which is not object, but sensibilities, you know. So things which are a way for us to deal with the unknown, with things that are tormented us. You know, it was how do we reorient ourselves, you know, in the midst of this moment when things are going to collapse. So it was much more that was interesting to me. The fact that we were about, I mean, I was in Palais de Tokyo was a huge space, you know, that was left in oblivion for many years, and rediscovered and kind of like, you know, re-habited by cultural practices. And I wanted to make a sort of a new plan, you know, to go through the space, and by hearing a sound next door, to deal with synchronicity and diachronicity, to deal with presence and absence, to deal with the fact that how can we go through a space, among the space, you know, and where the other is not the one blocking your view to look at a film, you know, that you want to chop his head off, but the person ahead in time of you, more aware of you, because he's been there a little ahead of you, you know. So I had the plan was more about that rather than anything else, really, you know. And of course, he had this kind of like flavor of maybe of nostalgia, but I think it was more about me dealing with my own subjectivity than anything. Yeah.
I want to ask you one last question and then go on to Duno and then open to the conversation, which is, I mean, you mentioned the way in which, let's say, biology informed many of your exhibitions. And that is one of the most surprising also contributions of your work in this meeting of the biological and the digital or the carnal. And, you know, if you look at E.A.T, I was surprised in seeing in Julie's images some sort of premonition of that, but I think maybe it's also in John Cage's fascination for mushrooms and fungi that you have a kind of feeling of life as a unpredictable manifestation that then has an influence on your work. So I don't know if you want to say something. It's a central aspect in your work. So
yeah, of course, it's but also when I was looking at the picture of Julie, I was imagining also the influence that maybe people like Terence McKenna I had like among a lot of people like at this time, the work of Philippe Parreno, of the work of also that was in a way dealing with future, or with the future, and so definitely that relation towards, let's say, because science fiction in a way is something that always dealt with the idea of technology and art, that was a domain of science fiction. If you think about the work of Stanislav Lem, for example, he was dealing with fiction as he was dealing also with his way to look at science. So there's a moment when, in fact, when E.A.T. started developing their fantastic works in collaboration with artists and scientists, something emerged which was like more used to be seen as literature, the world of possibilities, of what-if scenarios developed by fiction, fiction as developing ideas, and then was shifted toward visual art, and we're still all working on that. But yes, biology, when I did the turbinal with, I had a colony of bacteria that was leading as a sort of vanishing point at the end of the turbinal, the entire venue, so everything was moving towards that. That was a culture of macrobiotic beings, that were affecting or the space in which we were moving. Yeah. So yeah.
You mentioned Stanislav Lem, and one quote I always love from Solaris is the end, that he talks about the age of cruel miracles. And for him, the cruel miracle is the replication of life. Yeah. And I think in a sense, it's an element that many of these visions of the future share.
Yes, there was a line I was reading again recently, the Frankenstein novel of my Shelley, and on chapter 2, volume 3, the monster says something. The monster was, by the way, super educated and speaks 3 languages. He's vegan, and he wrote, so he's quite stunning. And he says something which is really stunning. He says, "How can you imagine being without being born?" And it's a lot of what we are dealing with. Like, at the end, it tends to be that problem that we're going to face, that mixed biology with information.
Well, I want to turn it over to Domhnaill, and you have resuscitated the experiments in art and technology, bringing them back at Nokia-Bell Labs for a few years, where you were the head of experiments in art and technology. So I want to ask you first maybe to talk about how that kind of reincarnation happened, and then I also, inevitably have to ask you, as a representative not only of creative energies, but in a sense of the industry. I was looking back at the wonderful book Pavilion that Julie edited, and which chronicles the Pepsi Pavilion in Osaka. And there is a quote by Calvin Tompkins that says, "The wedding of art and engineering is often celebrated on the altar of big business." And, obviously we know many complicated expectations come with that. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious how that happened. I guess you celebrated that wedding on a couple of occasions. So I'm curious about how does that feel?
Well, thanks for having me. Really great panel. I've learned so much. I'll tell you the story about how we reincarnated E.A.T. from a personal journey perspective, rather than from telling it from an institutional Bell Labs perspective. And Julie Martin had played a major role in that. So in May of 2016, I kind of went through a personal, significant inflection in my own way of thinking about the world, thinking about humanity and technology. And that came about because a few of us in Bell Labs were invited to these artist engineer meetup events in New York in celebration of the 9 evenings. It was the 50th anniversary. Honestly, in Bell Labs, we had institutionally forgot about the role that Bell Labs played in bringing art and technology together. We had forgotten about our role in E.A.T. We'd forgotten about our role outside of E.A.T. we learned about that history. We were intrigued, and there was other stuff going on in the background where we were trying to think about it, how we do research, how we do build technology for the good of humanity. Went to this meetup. From a personal perspective, you know, I'm an engineer, trained engineer, spent a lot of time around technology, business, products, stuff like that. Every conversation I had that night at the first meetup blew my mind. Like, I could not believe that with all of my education, all of my experience, all of these great minds that I had the great fortune to work with in Bell Labs and in universities across academia, that these artists had a perspective around humanity, the intersection of technology and humanity that I had never been exposed to. And I walked away from those meetups to completely having to question everything about my own existence, my own education, the value that I was or was not bringing to the world via my role in technology and business and industry. And Julie was there that night and for many nights after and helped me along my journey, educating me in embracing and bringing art and technology together and learning from the past and me tapping into her knowledge. So Julie has always been a great wealth to what we built in the modern day incarnation of experiments in arts and technology, which was named in honor of the original. So we, you know, there's a lot of talk about collaboration. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that. With anything in life, collaboration is really, really difficult. Even if you have two people from the same village that work on exactly the same discipline, getting them to do good collaboration is extremely difficult. Now, in my view, getting an artist to collaborate meaningfully with an engineer, a scientist, a technologist, or even a business person is difficult by 10 orders of magnitude more, because there's different world models, different ways of communicating, different ways of thinking about the world largely. So it's like oil and water in my experience. So a lot of the work we did when we created the modern day version was to come up with methodologies and frameworks and ways to bring artists purposefully and deeply into our engineering community. And when I did a lot of research and spoke to a lot of people all over the world that ran artist residencies at that time, I kind of found they largely fell into two buckets. One bucket was, to go back to your quote, the highly transactional, highly superficial industry engaging an artist around brand, around a product. Hey, here artists, make our product look cool. We'll pay you some money and then like go away. We don't really ever want to deal with you again, right? Very transactional, one-off, superficial. And then the other bucket was in industry and in academia, this what I would call a random ad hoc approach. So someone would intuitively believe that there's value in bringing art and science together, and they would randomly select an artist, randomly select the engineers and scientists, randomly select the space within which they would bring them together, and kind of just throw them in a room and say, hey, go off and have cool, creative conversations. Let's see what happens. And when I did my research on this and I spoke to people, I got quite frustrated around those two approaches to it, because I felt that the role of the artist in technology, the role of the artist in business was completely undervalued with that approach. And then I started thinking about my own journey, all the people I work with, all the people I hire coming out of, you know, graduates out of universities in technology. And I started realizing that there's a massive gap, not just my own personal knowledge gap, but a knowledge gap in industry around the value of artists, true value, deep value, if they're brought into the organizations in the right way. And I started realizing that the way people were being educated today, just like I was educated however many years before that, there was still a massive gap through education, that this human element that an artist naturally has, this more philosophical approach, the aesthetic nature, the questioning, always with humanity at the center, that was completely missing from almost everyone I deal with outside of artists. So I made it my life mission, my passion to create organizations and structures that could show the value of bringing these very different worlds together and being able to overcome those tensions. And when you go beyond a certain energy threshold to overcome the tensions, that's when magic occurs at the interface between these different disciplines. So I'll leave it at there for the sake of time, but that's really the value I saw. And yeah, there are challenges with industry. There are challenges in bringing these different worlds together, but when you do it right, with purpose, with strategic intent, with vision, and with collaboration at the heart of what you do, then, in my view, the future of innovation lies at that intersection, at the intersection of art and technology.
Maybe it's a question for Julie and for you, Duno, as well. Without getting too anecdotal, but I'm curious if we can talk about some of your experiences with collaboration, and particularly the moment in which artists and engineers have come together. There is a quote, probably the only speakable quote by our former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who said that a camel is a horse designed by committee. You know? That means that the collaboration, yes, leads to some forms of efficiency, but also to forms of compromise, forms of digression that might be fruitful or not. So, Julie, I want to ask you first if you had any experience, or if you want to tell us about some of those collaborations and how and in which ways they developed, and if you felt when you were involved in those collaborations that actually some form of authorship was more productive than others, or when interesting things happen when the outcome was really the product of a collective intelligence, so to speak. And then, Duno, I want to ask you also, and maybe we can also speak about Ed's collaboration from your perspective, and then we'll maybe turn it over to Philippe about his views on collaboration, which I'm sure are also quite interesting.
Wow, it's very hard. Actually, I don't mean to not answer your question, but I think it's one of the questions in the chat which I saw, which I think is really interesting and talks to some of the things other people are talking about, was collaborations between artists and scientists. I think with engineering in those days, it was very much like Steve Paxton speaks, physical things. The technology was about physical things, making things work. Science was very distant from the human being, I think, quasars and astronomy, these kinds of things. But as more recently, science becomes more human oriented with biology, et cetera, these kinds of things. I think the collaborations between artists and scientists becomes more relevant, and it comes into the present. And that's Philippe's work, et cetera. But I think it's very interesting that more art and science works and collaborations are work now than, say, in the 60s and 70s. I'm not answering your question, but I think I'm talking to another aspect of this idea of collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, the question, though, and I'm oversimplifying, is also a question around innovation and authorship. We have a kind of image of the artist and also of the scientist as a sort of individual creator and innovator. And on the other hand, we have the evidence of projects like E.A.T. and so on, where you can't even pinpoint,
well, I think,
who is the originator of the idea. And I don't know if you felt that way when you were witnessing and when you were part of those exchanges.
I think very much E.A.T. was artist-driven. I mean, it started with the idea of the possibility of making technology available to the artists, so that many of the projects, the early projects, 9 Evenings and Into the Pavilion, and the matching system was initiated by the artist. But I think the idea was that the engineer could contribute and it would change the project. I think Rauschenberg, I wasn't part of it, but I think the Rauschenberg Oracle, Bob had, of course, made paintings with little knobs on them where you could change your radio. And the first idea for, as I said, and Philippe has done it, I think in Luma, Bob talked to Billy about a room. And as you walk in, the presence of the individual would change, the light, the sound, maybe the shape. It was not that clear, but the idea that you could affect your environment, not possible at the time. So the first idea was a series of paintings, 5 paintings with the radios in back of them and with a stand out in front where, again, the individual could change the scan rate and the sound, but that the sound would be constant. And it just was impossible to do this kind of wireless. Bob wanted wireless, he wanted no wires. It was impossible in 62, 63 to do this, so that Bob got kind of bored, sent the paintings out as ACE, this 5-part painting, and he and Billy started working on it, objects about it, sound sculptures. And then as the technology caught up with them and the possibility of being able to do broadcasts in very small space, and the technology changed, then they were able to make a sculpture in which the sound came to radios and then was broadcast to the different pieces. So I think the idea that also in the 60s, the technology would catch up with the artists. Sometimes artists had ideas that weren't possible, weren't doable. And then it would end up being very different. So there's flexibility on both parts and a contribution. And actually, Billy did sign Oracle. Bob asked Billy to to sign it. And if you look at the plate on Oracle, which is now at Pompidou in Paris, it's signed by both. So that this question, it was a work of art essentially, but E.A.T. worked very hard to have the engineer get his credit that this was his or her contribution, but it was artist driven, I think you could say.
And Domhnaill, you want to talk about your experiences on that front?
Yeah, so I think like collaboration is compromise. You can't have good collaboration without compromise on with all parties. So in the particular work we've done, we've always put a lot of effort into ensure that the integration of the artist with the engineer and the engineer with the artist in the right way, in the right time to suit their personalities, their ways of working, their ways of collaborating, how they adapt, how they're open to different perspectives, how we bring all of that, how we curate that and how that manifests and how we help them through that process. We spend a lot of energy. So a lot of the work we did in the modern day variant that we created, in the last few years, a lot of it, you can see these very stunning looking visual outputs at exhibits and videos and stuff, and it all looks super cool. That for me is like 0.001% important in the overall work. 99 point however many nines you want to count of importance was around the process and the collaboration and bringing these different people together in the most meaningful way. So this idea, this notion, it's a kind of a fallacy, the lone inventor and the lone artistic great mind. A couple of them might have existed throughout humanity's history, but for the vast majority, there's actually in reality no such thing as the lone inventor, the lone genius artist. There's always a team around them, and every piece of inspiration they have, they can trace it back to other points of inspiration that have been fed to them and that they've synthesized in a different way. And so I think this idea of the lone inventor, lone genius doesn't quite reflect reality, although it is a good thing to be able to share from a media point of view. And I think the idea back to collaboration is extremely hard, and collaboration is compromise. If you're not compromising in collaboration, then by my definition, you're not collaborating. And people should think about that a bit more, because there's a lot of quote unquote collaborations on paper where both sides don't compromise. And even coming from industry, we have to compromise. We might be writing some checks for sure, but it's not meaningful engagement if we're not compromising, because otherwise we're not taking into perspective the views of the other side. The other side, in this case, being an artist.
Thank you. I want to go back to, and not to put Philippe on the spot, but a central question that actually emerges already from E.A.T, and that I think you face head on in your work is the, to simplify brutally, but the connection between technology and spectacle, and the notion of the passivization of the subject in front of technology. For all the efforts, even in the Pepsi pavilion, it was a spectacle machine, and it was a machine that you could claim was passivizing the viewers, and it was within also a very, very charged environment of the expo with Pepsi as a sponsor. So I want to ask you, and I think I asked you this question before actually, but how and if you worry about that, Philippe, in your work, if I think of your work, the work also Pierre Huyghe or Dominique, I think of your work, you have emerged in a moment in which also notions of spectacles were changing, in which the technology of reproduction, from the VCR was emerging. And so I'm curious if it's something you think about. And I also hate, when ideas of morality are so kind of Manichaean when it comes to art, because I think it's not necessarily your job, or, there is a question that it's up for grabs today, whether or not you have a moral responsibility towards those notions. But so it's a huge question, but I wonder if you think about it, the kind of deep-seated relationship between the spectacle and technology, and which is also the relationship between, let's say, corporation and technology, if those are thoughts that haunt your work or your sleep at night.
Yeah, of course we can talk about morality, why not, but then we have to go to the end. It's a bit like, when you drop a stone into a lake, how long are you going to be able to count the ripples across the water? So let's go for that, but it's a long journey. And why not you know, we know that art with, you know, the fact that not art, but I think the way art was communicated, you know, in the last years. I saw that coming, you know, with the Biennale and all this stuff, you know, we all part of that. Become in charge of something which I think is not really linked to art, you know, especially when you look at the work that and the pictures that Julie was skipping through, you know, you see that in fact there is a story in a way which is not, which is still unwritten, you know, which is a story where things, when forms occurred, you know, form which were not recorded. I like the word oracle or prophecy, things which we were not suspecting things to come, and they came. Forms came, you know, and those forms attracted attention for a moment and then been forgotten. And so I will rather sort of like insist on that. There's a moment when things can appear because it's a moment for things to appear, you know. And I grew up, you know, within a generation where artists were kind of like more inclined in a way to things about time than space, you know. How do we, there was a, Matthew said at some point in I remember that from some years ago when he said, we didn't really start, we making like this generation of artists, you know, didn't start to make videos in order to make films, but making videos in order to record object in time. And I think there's something about that which is still at stake when we talk about what Julie and the E.A.T performed and produced in the 60s and still today, you know. There's a moment when we have to deal with the fact that there's a mystery, you know, which is still for me a wonder when there's nothing and then there's something, you know, and then it's stunning, you know. There's a moment of attention. To go back to Lyotard, he talked about floating attention. Is at the moment when if you talk about Tate, for example, Tate, the turbine hole, which is like a big empty hole, you know, there's nothing there, right? It's just an empty hole. And same happened to MoMA, to a lot of these kind of like vast kind of like place for. And so how do you transform from nothing something, right? It's a peculiar thing that only happens within that close environment of art, visual art, you know. It's really strange. And you talked about Duchamp and others that kind of like shifted to that perspective where you talked about the viewers making the work, right? And Duchamp, this beautiful little logarithmic line called a guest plus the host equal a ghost. And I think it's nice because it sums up a lot of what we talked about. Even you running a museum, you know that, right? That it's all about creating that attention when you need both, you know. And yes, of course, it's a negotiation, but everything is negotiated, you know. And the form is a negotiation between a moment and a space, and we talked about oracle and the prediction. Something's about to come.
Yeah, and I mean the other question is, does a form have a responsibility? No, which I don't know if you think about,
yeah,
but I'm thinking.
But you talked about collaboration, which is funny because Julie talked about that a lot, and we talked about, but it means a lot of different things, which are maybe sometimes not in the same wheel. I think a collaboration for me is like grammar. It's a grammar, like in the Greek sense of grammar. It's like it's a place for unity. It's a place where we understand each other. You know, I've been collaborating with a lot of artists, as you know, and I've been collaborating with the same cinematographers in many years, the same people, sound designers, the same people so many years, because through time, we achieve a grammar, you know. So it's not really, you can't really reproduce it like that by saying, oh, okay, so when I work with Jaron Lanier, we talked about that because we talked about virtual reality, and I spoke and I worked with Jaron Lanier when I did my first show in Paris, and invited him to be my curator, so to speak, with André Chobrist. And Jaron had, you know, same kind of E.A.T kind of like for me like legacy, you know. Jaron invented the virtual reality, coined the terms virtual reality. He produced the data glow, the headset. Everything was produced by him. And but he was also came out from something specific that had been lost. This idea that you can come into a world, VR world, virtual world, where haptic, where you can touch things and affect things, you know. And the idea of Jaron was really much about this idea that there will be no softwares. You'll be run by the fact that you are, you know, when you are playing an instrument, the better you get at it, the better the computer will be good. You know, the better the world will be developed, you know, according to the way you move, the way you, how do you imagine being a lobster, you know? Like, how do you become something that you can imagine being, you know, how you can become a bacteria into the VR world, you know? So it was much more about this, this idea that we artists could, by the use technology in a way to do something that technology was not meant to do, you know, but through time. So time producing that grammar I'm talking about, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I saw Julie nodding, so I don't know if she has to add something.
Yeah.
No, it does make sense. It is about well, communication, really communicating and finding finding a way that you really can work together so that each person contributes what he or she can and to the project. Commitment, the other idea that certain commitment to a project, collaboration has that aspect, this kind of the very kind of seriousness that artists, I think artists and engineers and scientists can bring to a project. It's really important.
Mm-hmm.
There is a question from the audience about collaboration. I don't know if I understand it and summarize it properly, but it's a question about Charlotte Moorman and the shoulders of this collaboration. So I think what the question is aiming at is figures whose role, like that of Charlotte Moorman, it doesn't fit exactly in a history of hierarchies, and so she becomes a kind of sidekick or a shoulder rather than a full participant of that history, or you know. So maybe it's a question about exclusion out of narrative of collaboration, and I don't know if any of you has any thought. You know, does collaboration actually work also when then the history, as also Duno was saying somewhat polemically, has to follow certain ideas of who the protagonist is or who the main character is?
But I think Charlotte Moorman was very much she thought of herself as a performer, and she was certainly performing Nam June Paik's work. She was a diva, a performer, and a producer of these incredible festivals. But so probably more work has to be done on what her effect on Nam June Paik's work was. But I think at the time there wasn't a sense of exclusion, but the sense that she herself felt she was performing this work. TV cello, TV broad, this kind of thing. So she may not be the best example of this sidelining of history, I don't think. There are other sideliners, people being sidelined, but I think her sense of collaboration was a little bit different. People can argue with me on it, you know.
The idea of performance, though, leads us to another central idea within E.A.T. and also within Philippe's work, which is that of the score, no? The exhibition as a score, the exhibition as an event, as you mentioned also earlier, Philippe. I don't know if you imagine your shows as scores, or how do you write them?
Yeah. So to go back to it, it's open score, you know. It's, no, but it's how do you for example, the fact that we can, you know, and place microphone outside the space, like which is not isolated. You know, modernity projected to make it different. I don't know. We can spend hours talking about that, but to make it short, modernity produce boxes, as you know. So you have the white box to show objects. You have the black box to show moving images or sound, and you have the night box to go and dance and whatever and go crazy. But it's a story of boxes. So if you want to do something else, to go backwards, so to speak, to go backwards, for me, I mean, and I think I may be totally wrong because I'm not an art historian, but there's some time when it was possible, in fact, to tell a story within a white box, or to present object in a black box. You know, there was not we have to be decolonized from the 19th century that put things in boxes, you know, and to go backward, but there was a time we call phantasmagoria, or pre-early forms of cinema, where things were, where there was a possibility to dialogue with the dead, and or to engage with all the forms. We talked about spectacle, all the forms of spectacle, you know, which were not like based on the current adopted formats. And I think maybe a way for we talked about the cyber manifesto of ours. There's ways to do things differently today, you know, more than ever, and outside of the box that contains pre-knowledge. But it's time to go to things, as the scholar said, about things that we don't know, you know? And to open the barricades a little bit, where things can be more interconnected, and produce things, as an oracle will do, things that we don't know yet, you know. Prophecies are important, you know. Prophecies. Yeah.
Also, just to say something, it's also interesting about putting E.A.T. in its time.
Yeah.
You know, I was certainly hearing Philippe talk and all the possibilities available to an artist. And when you talk about the pavilion as a sort of it was not passive based on what had gone before. It was very much the idea. The artist had the idea, you know, but up to that you had you rode through exhibit. You got in a little car and you rode through exhibit. So the idea of a pavilion in which people could explore on their own was a step forward. It was a step to participation. It was definitely spectacle, but it was a step forward. So I think you're talking about these different steps now with virtual reality and the other tools that Philippe has available. You can go to a new level of participation, in the spectacle.
Well, I think clearly it's a conversation that, you know, ultimately it's a conversation also about immortality, as I think on many
Aren't they all?
moments, yeah, aren't they all? So
yes,
I think,
and the immortality in the use of drugs, you know, to unveil to rediscover the real, you know, behind the veil. We have to break the barricades. Let's take everything we can to do that. We have time to do it, no?
So you're back to morality, not just immortality, but morality.
Yeah.
But I was actually just trying to find also a clever ending to this wonderful conversation, which is,
you know, not be able to do that.
Time is up.
I have this one, that for a movement that famously questioned the distance between art and life, I guess we need to return our audience to life. And thank you all.
There was a beautiful line from Fluxus artists who said, "Art, it's what makes life more interesting than art."
Yeah.
Right. That's a good one. That's a good way to end, no?
So yeah, that's a good ending. But thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to see you all. And hopefully we'll do this soon again. In person. Or
Thank you so much.
Thank you.